At 2:34 p.m. on August 8, 1944, Sergeant Chester William Kowalski felt the first German shell slam into the front armor of his M4 Sherman and knew that the day was about to get interesting. The 75mm round from the concealed Panzer IV struck the glacis plate at an angle, deflected upward, and screamed into the sky, leaving a bright gouge in the olive-drab paint but failing to penetrate. Kowalski had time to think one word: lucky, before the second shell hit, then the third. He was 24 years old, a steelworker's son from Gary, Indiana, commander of a Sherman tank named Crazy Mary in the 3rd Armored Division, 32nd Armored Regiment, and he was leading his platoon through a gap in the German lines near the town of Mortagne in northwestern France. Kowalski had grown up in the shadow of the steel mills, the same mills where his father and grandfather had worked, where the furnaces ran day and night and the air tasted of smoke and metal. He had dropped out of high school at 16 to work at U.S. Steel, had spent 2 years hauling scrap and learning the trade, had been preparing for a life of 12-hour shifts and union meetings when Pearl Harbor had changed everything. He had enlisted in the armored force because tanks seemed like the future, like machines that could change the war, like something more than just walking into machine gun fire the way his uncles had done in the First War. He had trained at Fort Knox, had learned to drive and maintain and command the M4 Sherman, had shipped out to England in early 1944 and landed in France 3 weeks after D-Day. His crew had been with him since Fort Knox. Private First Class Tommy Nowak, the driver, was 19 years old, a farm kid from Nebraska who had lied about his age to enlist and had proven to be one of the best drivers in the regiment. He could make a Sherman dance, could back through hedgerows and cross ditches that would have stopped other drivers, could feel the tank's limits the way a horseman feels his mount. Corporal Jimmy Brennan, the loader, was 22, a Chicago firefighter's son who had grown up around burning buildings and had developed the kind of calm, under-pressure temperament that made him perfect for working in a tank's cramped turret. He could load rounds faster than anyone in the battalion, and he never panicked, no matter how bad things got. Sergeant Mike Delacroix, the gunner, was 25, a Cajun from Lafayette, Louisiana, who had been a competitive shooter before the war. He could put rounds through the same hole at 500 yards, could calculate windage and elevation in his head, faster than most men could read a chart. He was the reason Crazy Mary had more kills than any other tank in the company. The bow gunner and assistant driver, Private Harold Whitey Whitman, was barely 18, a replacement who had joined them 2 weeks earlier. Whitey was from somewhere in Ohio, quiet and nervous, still learning the rhythm of tank combat. He wouldn't survive Mortagne. A German shell would find the Hull machine gun position later that afternoon, but he didn't know that yet. None of them knew what the next few hours would bring. The mission was simple on paper: punch through the enemy defenses, reach the crossroads 2 miles ahead, and hold it until the infantry arrived. The mission was not simple in practice. Nothing in Normandy was simple. The Germans had launched Operation Lüttich that morning, a desperate counterattack aimed at cutting off Patton's breakout from the Normandy beachhead. Hitler himself had ordered the attack, overriding his general's objections, insisting that a bold stroke could reverse the catastrophe unfolding in France. 4 panzer divisions, the 2nd SS, the 1st SS, the 2nd Panzer, and the 116th Panzer, had struck the American lines near Mortagne, catching the 30th Infantry Division by surprise, threatening to split the Allied forces and trap hundreds of thousands of soldiers against the English Channel. It was the largest German armored offensive since the Battle of the Bulge would dwarf it 4 months later, and it had come close to succeeding. The Germans had penetrated several miles on the first day, had surrounded an American battalion on a hill called La Montagne, had created panic in rear echelon units that hadn't expected to see German tanks. For a few hours on the morning of August 8th, it seemed possible that the Wehrmacht might actually reverse the tide of the war. But the attack had been launched in daylight, under clear skies, and the Allied air forces had responded with devastating force. Fighter bombers had swarmed the German columns, destroying tanks and trucks and artillery pieces faster than they could be replaced. The forward momentum had stalled, and by afternoon, the Germans were fighting not to advance, but to survive. Kowalski's platoon had been thrown into the gap as a blocking force. 4 Shermans against an unknown number of German tanks and infantry. They had been advancing through bocage country, the hedgerow-enclosed fields that had turned Normandy into a nightmare for American armor when the ambush began. The Panzer IV that had opened fire was dug into a hull-down position behind a stone wall, only its turret visible above the rocks. A second German tank was positioned 200 yards to its left, creating a crossfire that covered the entire road. Behind them, Kowalski could see the distinctive shapes of at least 2 more panzers, and beyond those, the muzzle flashes of anti-tank guns that were already finding the range. The 4th shell hit Crazy Mary's turret ring, jamming the mechanism that allowed the turret to rotate. The turret traverse motor screamed, gears grinding against bent metal, and then fell silent. They were now a tank with a fixed gun, able to aim only by turning the entire vehicle, except that they were about to lose the ability to do even that. The 5th shell struck the right track, throwing a shower of sparks and bending 2 of the track links without breaking them. The 6th shell, this one from a different direction, probably the 2nd Panzer IV, punched through the armor just above the driver's hatch, passed between Nowak's head and Whitman's shoulder, close enough that both men felt the heat of the passing metal, and buried itself in the engine compartment. Time seemed to stop. Kowalski waited for the explosion, waited for the fuel tanks to ignite, waited for the death that should have followed a penetrating hit. It didn't come. The shell had been a dud. Its fuse failing to detonate, its warhead lodged somewhere in the engine compartment where it could have killed them all, but hadn't. A dud. They were still alive because the German shell had been a dud. "Back up!" Kowalski shouted into his intercom. "Get us behind that wall!" Private First Class Tommy Nowak, the driver, was already moving. Nowak was 19 years old, a farm kid from Nebraska who had lied about his age to enlist and had proven to be one of the best drivers in the regiment. He threw Crazy Mary into reverse, the tank's 400 horsepower engine roaring, the tracks churning the muddy road as he backed toward a partially collapsed stone wall that might provide cover. The 7th shell hit as they moved, glancing off the side armor at an angle that sent it ricocheting into a hedgerow. The 8th shell missed entirely, exploding in the field to their left. The 9th shell, another 75mm round from the Panzer IV, struck the turret face dead center. The impact was deafening. Inside the turret, Kowalski felt like someone had hit the tank with a giant hammer. His loader, Corporal Jimmy Brennan, was thrown against the breech of the 75mm gun, opening a gash above his eye that immediately began to bleed. The gunner, Sergeant Mike Delacroix, cursed in Cajun French and reported that his optical sight was cracked but still functional. The shell had not penetrated. The Sherman's turret armor, 6 inches of cast steel at the mantelet, had held, but the turret was still jammed, frozen in place, unable to traverse left or right. Crazy Mary's main gun was pointed dead ahead, and if the enemy moved to either flank, they would have no way to engage. "Driver, get us hull down behind that wall and stop." Kowalski was already calculating angles, trying to figure out how to fight a tank battle with a gun that couldn't move. "Gunner, what's your status?" "Sight's damaged, but I can still see. Gun looks okay. Ready to fire when you are." "Load a P." Brennan, blood streaming down his face, grabbed a 75mm armor-piercing round from the ready rack and slammed it into the breech. AP loaded. Crazy Mary lurched to a stop behind the stone wall, her hull partially protected, her turret and gun exposed above the rocks. It wasn't a good position. The wall was too low to provide real cover, but it was better than sitting in the open road. The 10th shell hit the wall in front of them, showering the tank with stone fragments. The 11th shell struck Crazy Mary's front armor again, another deflection that left a scar but didn't penetrate. Kowalski ignored both impacts. He was looking through his periscope at the Panzer IV that had started the ambush, calculating range, calculating angle, calculating whether his stationary gun could hit a target that was partially concealed behind a stone wall 400 yards away. "Gunner, target, Panzer IV, 400 yards, behind the wall. You see him?" "I see him, Sarge. He's hull down. I can only see his turret." "That's all we need. Fire when ready." The Sherman's 75mm gun roared. Kowalski watched the tracer streak across the field, watched it arc slightly downward, watched it strike the Panzer's turret just below the commander's cupola. The German tank lurched, smoke began to pour from its hatches, and a moment later the crew bailed out, abandoning their vehicle before the ammunition cooked off. Target destroyed, one down, a whole bunch to go. But the other German tanks were already adjusting, shifting their fire, trying to destroy the Sherman that had just killed their companion. The 12th shell hit Crazy Mary's engine deck, punching through the thinner armor and starting a fire in the engine compartment. The 13th shell struck the turret again, closer to the breach this time, and Kowalski heard something crack inside the gun mechanism. "We're on fire!" Nowak's voice was tight with fear but controlled. "Engine compartment's burning. Delacroix, keep shooting. Brennan, get the extinguisher." If you want to see how a burning Sherman with a jammed turret and 17 hits managed to complete its mission and make it home, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Kowalski. Brennan grabbed the fire extinguisher mounted on the turret wall and squeezed past Kowalski, dropping into the hull to reach the engine compartment. The fire was spreading, fed by leaking fuel and hydraulic fluid, and the extinguisher was barely adequate for the job. But Brennan was a former Chicago firefighter's son who had grown up around burning buildings, and he attacked the flames with a methodical precision that belied the chaos around him. While Brennan fought the fire, Delacroix kept shooting. The gun was damaged, the recoil mechanism was sluggish, the breech was sticking, but it still fired. He put a round into the 2nd Panzer IV, missed with the second shot, and hit it again with the third. The German tank began to burn. The 14th shell hit Crazy Mary's right track, this time with enough force to break 2 links. The track sagged, and suddenly the tank was unable to move, immobilized in a partially exposed position, burning, with at least 2 more German tanks still firing at her. "Track's gone," Nowak reported. "We're not going anywhere." Kowalski made a decision. "Brennan, is that fire out?" "Mostly she might catch again, but she's not gonna blow." "Then get back on the loader's position. We're staying in the fight." They stayed in the fight. With their tank immobilized, their turret jammed, their engine damaged, and their armor scarred by a dozen impacts, the crew of Crazy Mary continued to engage the enemy. Delacroix, working with a cracked sight and a malfunctioning gun, destroyed a 3rd German tank, a Panzer IV that had tried to flank their position. Brennan kept loading rounds even as blood from his head wound dripped onto the ammunition. Nowak, with nothing to drive, grabbed the hull machine gun and began engaging German infantry that had appeared at the edge of the hedgerow. The 15th shell hit the turret's side armor, penetrating partially but stopping before it reached the crew compartment. The 16th shell struck the gun mantelet, damaging the elevation mechanism and leaving the 75mm gun stuck pointing slightly downward. The 17th shell, the last one that would hit Crazy Mary, struck the commander's cupola, shattering the periscope and filling the turret with fragments. One of those fragments caught Kowalski in the left shoulder, embedding itself in the muscle, sending pain radiating down his arm. Another fragment struck Whitey, the bow gunner, in the neck. The young Ohioan slumped over his machine gun without a sound, his blood pooling on the hull floor, his eyes open and staring at nothing. Kowalski saw him die. There was nothing to do, no way to help, no time to mourn. He noted it, filed it away, and kept fighting. That was what tank combat demanded. You kept fighting until you won or you died, and you dealt with everything else afterward. "Whitey's gone," Nowak's voice cracked. "He's gone, Sarge." "I know. Keep your head down and stay ready. This isn't over." It wasn't over, but it was ending. At 3:47 p.m., the German attack began to falter. The Panzers had expected to roll over the American blocking force, to break through to the crossroads and cut the road that was feeding Patton's advance. Instead, they had lost 3 tanks to a single Sherman that refused to die, and the delay had allowed American reinforcements to arrive. Tank destroyers from the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion appeared on the ridge to the east, their 76mm guns reaching out to engage the remaining German armor. P-47 Thunderbolts arrived overhead, their bombs and rockets turning the hedgerows into infernos. The surviving German tanks began to withdraw, pulling back toward their starting positions, leaving their dead behind. The infantry that had accompanied them melted into the bocage, and within 30 minutes, the field that had been a killing ground was silent except for the crackle of burning vehicles. Crazy Mary sat in her position behind the stone wall, smoking, scarred, immobilized, but intact. Her crew was still at their stations. Kowalski in the commander's hatch, despite his wounded shoulder. Delacroix at the gun, despite his cracked sight. Brennan on the loader's position, despite the blood still seeping from his head wound. Nowak at the driver's seat, despite having nothing left to drive. "Sarge!" Delacroix's voice was hoarse. "Is it over?" Kowalski scanned the field through his shattered periscope. Burning tanks, German and American alike. Bodies in the hedgerows. The smoke of a battle that had lasted less than 90 minutes, but had felt like a lifetime. "Yeah," he said. "I think it's over." The damage assessment came later, after the medics had bandaged Kowalski's shoulder and stitched Brennan's scalp, after the recovery crews had examined Crazy Mary and cataloged her wounds, after Whitey's body had been removed from the hull and sent back for burial. The count was sobering: 17 direct hits from German tanks and anti-tank guns. The ordnance officers walked around the tank, marking each impact with chalk, numbering them, photographing them for the after-action report. 3 penetrations, one that had passed through the hull without detonating, one that had stopped just short of the crew compartment, one that had shattered the commander's cupola. The turret traverse mechanism was destroyed. The right track was broken in 2 places. The engine had been on fire. The gun's recoil and elevation mechanisms were damaged. The optical sight was cracked. The commander's periscope was shattered. Hull machine gun position was destroyed. One of the ordnance officers, a captain named Williams, had been evaluating tank damage since North Africa. He had seen hundreds of knocked-out Shermans, had cataloged every way that a tank could be destroyed, had developed an instinct for what was survivable and what wasn't. "This shouldn't be possible," Williams said, shaking his head at Crazy Mary's scarred hull. 17 hits, 3 penetrations, engine fire, immobilized, and 4 of you walked away. He looked at Kowalski. "How in God's name did you survive this?" Kowalski didn't have an answer. By any reasonable standard, Crazy Mary should have been destroyed. The Sherman was not known for its survivability. The tank had earned the grim nickname Ronson because it lit up so easily, lights every time. American tankers knew they were driving inferior machines, knew that the German 75mm and 88mm guns could punch through their armor at ranges where their own 75mm guns couldn't reply. They accepted this because someone had to crew the tanks, and they trusted their training and their luck to see them through. Kowalski and his crew had needed both. They had needed training that kept them fighting when everything was falling apart, that allowed Delacroix to hit targets with a damaged sight, that enabled Brennan to fight a fire while shells were still hitting the tank. And they had needed luck. The dud round that should have killed them all, the angles of deflection that sent shells glancing off instead of punching through, the 17 hits that somehow failed to find the fuel tanks or the ammunition rack. "How are we still alive?" Brennan asked the question that all of them were thinking. 17 hits, and we're still alive. Kowalski didn't have an answer. He looked at his tank, at the scars and holes and gouges that covered her hull like wounds on a prizefighter's face, and he shook his head. "She's a tough old girl," he said, "and we're a lucky crew." But there was more to it than luck. The M4 Sherman had been designed with survival in mind. Not the kind of survival that came from heavy armor, but the kind that came from redundant systems, from fire suppression equipment, from hatches that allowed crews to escape quickly when their tanks were hit. Crazy Mary's crew had survived because the tank had given them a chance to survive, and because they had been good enough to take that chance. The crossroads that had been their objective was secured by 6 p.m. infantry from the 30th Division moved up to establish a defensive perimeter, and the tankers who had held the line were finally able to stand down. Kowalski sat on Crazy Mary's engine deck, his wounded arm in a sling, watching the sun set over the Normandy hedgerows. Lieutenant William Morrison, the platoon leader, came to find him. Morrison was only 22, younger than some of the men he commanded, but he had proven himself in the weeks since Normandy, and had earned the respect of his tankers. "Hell of a thing, Sergeant," Morrison said, looking at the damaged Sherman. "I counted the hits myself, 17. You know what the odds are of surviving 17 hits?" "Pretty low, I imagine." "Pretty damn low." Morrison shook his head. "The battalion commander wants to see you," Something about a medal. Kowalski shrugged with his good shoulder. We were just doing our job, Lieutenant. The whole crew deserves credit, not just me. The whole crew's getting credit, but you're the one who kept them fighting. You're the one who knocked out 3 German tanks with a jammed turret and a damaged gun. That's not just doing your job, Kowalski. That's something else. The medal was a Silver Star, awarded 3 weeks later in a ceremony that Kowalski found faintly embarrassing. He stood in a row with other soldiers who had distinguished themselves in the Mortain fighting, infantry sergeants who had held their positions against impossible odds, medics who had crawled through fire to rescue wounded men, officers who had rallied their troops when everything was falling apart. The 30th Division's commander pinned the medal on his chest and shook his hand, and photographers took pictures for the hometown newspapers. The citation was read aloud. For gallantry in action against the enemy on August 8, 1944, near Mortain, France. Sergeant Kowalski, commanding a tank that was hit 17 times by enemy fire, continued to engage hostile armor despite immobilization, fire damage, and serious wounds. His actions resulted in the destruction of 3 enemy tanks and directly contributed to the defense of a critical road junction. Sergeant Kowalski's extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty reflect great credit upon himself and the armed forces of the United States. Kowalski listened to the words and felt like a fraud. He hadn't been brave. He had been scared out of his mind, had felt certain he was going to die with every shell that hit, had wanted nothing more than to bail out and run. The only thing that had kept him in the tank was the knowledge that his crew needed him, that running away would mean leaving them to die. That was what leadership meant, he supposed. Not being braver than the men you led, but being more afraid of failing them than of dying yourself. Crazy Mary was repaired. The Army's maintenance crews worked miracles in the hedgerows of Normandy, salvaging tanks that should have been scrap, patching armor that should have been replaced, getting damaged vehicles back into action in days rather than the weeks that proper repairs would have required. By the end of August, Crazy Mary was back in the line, her scars painted over, her damaged components replaced, ready to fight again. Kowalski stayed with her. He could have requested a transfer. No one would have blamed him after what he had been through, but the thought never occurred to him. Crazy Mary was his tank. She had kept him alive through 17 hits. He owed her the same loyalty. They fought through France and into Belgium, through the disaster at the Bulge and the grinding advance into Germany. The Battle of the Bulge was the worst, a frozen nightmare of ambushes and counterattacks, of fuel shortages and desperate fighting in conditions that made Normandy look pleasant. Kowalski was wounded twice more during that terrible winter. A burn on his right hand from a German incendiary round that caught the tank's external storage, shrapnel in his leg from an artillery shell that killed the tank next to him. Nowak was killed at the Bulge. They had been advancing through a Belgian village when a German Panzerfaust, a shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket, had struck Crazy Mary's front plate. The shape-charged warhead had penetrated just enough to spray molten metal into the driver's compartment. Nowak had died instantly, the Nebraska farm kid who could make a Sherman dance, killed at 19 years old in a country he couldn't have found on a map before the war. Kowalski had pulled Nowak's body from the driver's seat himself, had wrapped him in a tarpaulin and left him for Graves' registration, had climbed back into the tank and kept fighting. That was what you did. That was all you could do. Brennan was wounded badly enough to be sent home in February 1945. A German sniper's bullet had shattered his right elbow, ending his days as a loader. Delacroix was promoted to command his own tank in March, a recognition of the skill that had destroyed 4 German tanks at Mortain and a dozen more in the months since. New men came to fill the empty positions, young faces that Kowalski barely learned to recognize before they were gone, replaced by other young faces, an endless cycle of replacement crews who looked to him to teach them how to survive. He taught them what he could. He couldn't teach them everything. Some things could only be learned by living through them. But Kowalski remained, the constant at the center of a rotating cast of young men who came to Crazy Mary to learn how to survive. The war ended on May 8, 1945. Kowalski was in Czechoslovakia when the news came, having pushed deeper into German territory than anyone had expected when the landings began. He sat on Crazy Mary's turret, smoking a cigarette, watching German soldiers march past into captivity, and felt nothing in particular, Relief, maybe. Exhaustion, certainly. But no joy. He had seen too much to feel joy. He had lost too many friends to celebrate. He went home to Gary, Indiana in August 1945. The steel mills were running full blast, feeding the peacetime economy that was already replacing the war economy. And Kowalski could have had his old job back if he wanted it. He didn't want it. He had spent 3 years in confined spaces, first in the mill and then in the tank, and he wanted something different. He wanted to work outside, under open sky, where nothing could trap him. He took a job with a construction company, building houses for the veterans who were coming home by the millions, who were getting married and having children and creating the baby boom that would reshape America. The work started in the subdivisions south of Chicago, rows of identical houses rising from cornfields that had been farmland a year before. Kowalski learned carpentry from a foreman named O'Brien, who had lost his right arm at Guadalcanal and had learned to swing a hammer left-handed. He learned plumbing from a master plumber named Rossetti, who had spent the war building water systems for army bases and now applied the same skills to bathrooms and kitchens. He learned electrical work from a former Navy electrician named Johnson, who could wire a house faster than anyone in the company. He discovered that he loved the work. There was something healing about building things, about watching a house rise from foundation to frame to finished home. Every nail he drove was a small act of creation, a counterweight to the destruction he had witnessed. Every family that moved into a house he had built was a small victory, a life that would go on because someone had provided them with shelter. By 1955, he had started his own company, Kowalski Construction, specializing in residential homes in the suburbs south of Gary. He employed 15 men at his peak, most of them veterans like himself, men who understood the value of honest work and the importance of building something that would last. They built hundreds of houses over the following decades, sturdy homes that would shelter families for generations. He married Dorothy Jankowski in 1947, a nurse he had met at the VA hospital where they treated his shoulder wound. She was small and dark-haired, with a quick smile and a no-nonsense attitude that came from years of dealing with wounded soldiers who felt sorry for themselves. She had seen Kowalski at his worst, feverish from infection, struggling with nightmares that made him cry out in his sleep, and she had not been frightened away. Their courtship had been unconventional. Kowalski was still in the hospital when he asked her to dinner, still wearing a sling, still uncertain whether his shoulder would ever heal properly. Dorothy had accepted because she liked his eyes, she told him later. Eyes that had seen terrible things but hadn't gone hard, hadn't lost the capacity for kindness. They married in a small ceremony at St. Stanislaus Church, the same church where Kowalski had been baptized and confirmed. His parents were there, his father still working at the steel mill, his mother still lighting candles for the son who had come home when so many hadn't. Brennan came down from Chicago to be best man, his right arm still weak from the wound that had sent him home. Dorothy was the daughter of Polish immigrants, like his own parents, and she understood without being told the things that Kowalski carried from the war. She never asked about the nightmares that still woke him sometimes, never pressed him to talk about what he had seen. She simply loved him, and that was enough. They had 4 children, Chester Jr., Margaret, Thomas, and little Anna. They raised them in a house that Kowalski built himself, on a lot in the suburbs south of Gary, a brick ranch with a big backyard where the kids could play. He coached Little League, served on the parish council at St. Stanislaus Church, and became known as a man who could fix anything: cars, appliances, plumbing, whatever his neighbors needed. He never spoke about the war to his children. When they asked about his medals, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, he would say only that he had been a tank commander, that he had done his duty, that many men had done more. He did not tell them about Mortain, about the 17 hits, about the day when he had been certain he was going to die and had kept fighting anyway. In 1994, a documentary filmmaker named James Hartwell contacted Kowalski while producing a film about American tankers in World War II. Hartwell had found the after-action reports from Mortain, had located the Silver Star citation, had tracked down the story of the Sherman that had survived 17 hits. He flew to Indiana, set up cameras in Kowalski's living room, and asked him to describe what had happened. Kowalski was 74 years old then, retired from construction, his hair white, and his hands showing the arthritis that decades of physical labor had produced. Dorothy sat beside him during the interview, hearing details she had never heard in 47 years of marriage. "The thing people don't understand about tanks," Kowalski said slowly, "is how small they are inside. You're sitting in this metal box with 4 other men, surrounded by ammunition and fuel, and every time you go into combat, you know that one hit in the wrong place means you all burn to death. The Sherman wasn't a good tank. We knew that. The Germans had better armor, better guns, better everything, but we had more tanks, and we had each other." "What kept you fighting when the hits kept coming?" Hartwell asked. 17 times you were hit, and you never bailed out. You never ran. Why?" Kowalski was quiet for a long moment. "I thought about it," he admitted. "After the turret jammed, after the fire started, I thought about telling the crew to bail out. It would have been the smart thing to do. But then I looked at Brennan with blood running down his face, and Delacroix still trying to aim that damaged gun, and Nowak ready to do whatever I told him, and I couldn't do it. They were counting on me. If I gave up, they would give up. And if we all gave up, the Germans would break through, and a lot more people would die. So you stayed." "So I stayed," Kowalski shrugged. "I was the commander. It was my job to stay. It was my job to keep them fighting. Everything else, the hits, the fire, the fear, that was just the price of doing the job." Hartwell's documentary aired on the History Channel in 1995. The segment on Kowalski ran nearly 15 minutes, including photographs of Crazy Mary's damaged hull and interviews with surviving members of the crew. The segment was titled 17 Hits. Chester William Kowalski died on January 3, 2009, at the age of 88. Heart failure, the doctors said, after a long decline that had begun 2 years earlier. He passed at home, in the house he had built with his own hands, with Dorothy and their children around him. At the funeral, held at St. Stanislaus Church in Gary, his son Thomas spoke about what his father had meant to him. He talked about the house his father had built, about the neighborhood his father had helped create, about the quiet example of a man who had faced death and chosen duty over survival. "Dad never called himself a hero," Thomas said. "When people asked about his medals, he would change the subject. He would talk about the men who didn't come home, about the ones who deserved medals but never got them. But I found something in his papers after he passed, a letter he wrote to Mom in 1947 trying to explain what had happened at Mortain." Thomas unfolded a yellowed piece of paper and began to read. "I should have died that day. 17 times the Germans hit us, and any one of those shells could have been the end. But we didn't die. We kept fighting, kept shooting, kept doing our job, and somehow we made it through. I don't know why. I don't know what makes the difference between the ones who live and the ones who die, but I know this. As long as I was alive, as long as my crew was alive, we were going to keep fighting. That was the only thing I could control. The rest was up to God." Thomas folded the letter. Dad spent the rest of his life building things, houses, families, communities. He said once that he was trying to make up for all the destruction, to put something back into the world. I don't know if he ever felt like he succeeded, but I know this. The house he built is still standing. The family he raised is still here. And the lesson he taught us, that you keep fighting, no matter how bad it gets, that lesson will stay with us forever. 17 hits. 4 crew members who refused to quit. A tank called Crazy Mary that brought them home. The M4 Sherman that Chester Kowalski commanded at Mortain was eventually returned to the United States after the war. She was refurbished and placed on display at a Veterans Memorial in Gary, Indiana in 1955, where she remained until 2001. The tank now resides at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, her armor still bearing the scars of 17 German shells, a testament to the crew who kept her fighting when fighting seemed impossible. If you want to hear more forgotten stories from the Second World War, please subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. These men are gone now, their stories fading with them. The least we can do is remember. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.